Hi everyone, this is Lowell and discussing music theory with you. And we've talked about rhythm. Now we're in this subject of melody and what comprises melody. As some of you might know, I'm a violinist, and much of what I have been involved in music in my own, I guess, connection point to music has been melodic in nature. And I think melodically. As a matter of fact, my father, who was my first composition teacher, who was a trumpet player, so he thought melodically as well. But he studied with some of the great composers in Vienna in the same kind of mindset that Schoenberg and Webern and Berg came from over in Vienna. And some of his teachers really emphasized to him the importance and value of melodic writing instead of simply harmonic writing. And if you look at J.S. Bach's work, I've sat through many classes where people try to analyze Bach from a purely harmonic standpoint, but in my opinion, you really miss the value of what Bach was trying to do if you only think harmonically, or if you predominantly think harmonically. I believe that Bach, who was also a violinist as well as a keyboard player, that in Bach's mind, he thought about the linear predominantly. And the reason I say that, if you open up the book of that he wrote for his students to learn from, the 2 and 3 part inventions, he talks about in his preface to that book. I wrote this so that you can learn the cantabile style of playing and also how to compose. That's paraphrasing, but cantabile means singing, and so or linear. And so his mindset was linear in his writing. And so much of my concept. This is why I started writing, or not writing, but speaking with you about rhythm first, and then melody, and then that leads to harmony. Rhythm, in my view, can be seen as the extreme against melody. So rhythm is very vertical. You know, these points of demarcation of time. And then against that, you have melody, which is very horizontal. And so it's where the vertical and the horizontal meet that creates harmony. And so you have these two extremes. That's why I started out talking about rhythm, and now we're talking about melody. And so melody is really linear. And so as we talk about melody, melody can encompass harmony, and but it also predominantly is horizontal and linear. And maybe the best analogy that I can give, metaphor, would be an eagle or some bird, that's flying high up in the air, and they don't need to flap their wings in order to stay up. They've just caught a current, and they just have their wings spread out, and they're just soaring in the air. And that's maybe the best analogy I can give you in terms of what a melody does. Is it moves horizontally, and it also moves in a what's the best word of talking about this? It moves in a direction, like it's going to be going up, and it's going to be going down, it's going to be going to the side, but it's always flowing. And as some of you may know that I have a background in as a music director at a church for many decades, and I did some deep study from the biblical understanding of music, which there's much to be discovered in the Bible, parenthetically, about music. But the very first musician that was cited in the book of Genesis in the Bible, his name was Jubal. And if you look up the definition of the name Jubal, it means to flow, and to flow like a river. And so that's what I'm talking about. Music is not meant to be vertical, in my opinion, predominantly. And in much pop culture today, there's a lot of emphasis on rhythm, and beat, and particularly static beat that's produced by a computer or machine, such as a click track, to keep everybody in time. But in my opinion, melody goes against that. And so to think predominantly melody from a theory standpoint, it's one of the most important, in my view, aspects of all of music, is to think melodically and linearly. Now I have my keyboard here, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what a melody can look like. Last time we talked about intervals, and intervals are helpful. Here's where understanding of intervallic relationships can help in terms of crafting melody. We talked about chromaticism and diatonicism, and what can happen with melody is you can use melody to craft harmony, and that is like a scalar version of chords. And so that's one way that you can use melody. For example, I'll just craft a melody using some triads. So you can, use basically harmonic outlines with your melodic fragments. Another thing that Bach really did lovely is he would craft two different parts, or even three different parts, inside of a melody to show the linear part. Like, say, if you had a bass line and then a melody at top, but he would split it. And so let's say that you wanted to have a melody up here that was doing this, but then you were oscillating from that to a bass line. And so the way Bach would do it would be something like this. Sorry, I messed up. And so you would oscillate between the two different melodies. And he played around with essentially creating a counterpoint even inside of one melodic line. And I refer you to the sonatas and partitas, the unaccompanied sonatas and partitas that he wrote for violin, only violin. So that's a very interesting thing that he played with melodically in that work. There was no accompaniment. Essentially, he termed that that the violin would actually accompany itself. But how can a melodic instrument accompany itself when it has no capacity, or some capacity for harmonic expression, but predominantly melodic expression? And he would do it the same way I just showed you, by splitting these different elements inside of a melody. So that's a little bit of a discussion of melody. From a counterpoint standpoint and how it relates to harmony. I just finished rereading a book about Pierre Boulez and how he worked with serialism and basically extended serialism techniques. And what composers in the 20th century would do is take the chromatic scale and utilize patterns in it. And so pattern creation is another element of melody. If you, say, take this little fragment and then you extend it to another range, just simplistically, and so you have repeated phrases like that. But let's say that you took, instead of 3 notes, you took a pattern of all 12 notes, and this goes back to serialism techniques. Let me bring the octave up. And so something like, a serialism technique, you only use one of the 12 notes until you've used all typically you can't reuse any of the notes until you've used all of them. And so a serialist chromatic melody might sound something like this. And so that's a fairly complex melody. But each one of those intervals can be written down as a number sequence. And so you have numbers 1 through 11, and then you can modulate that, or do it backwards, or do it forwards, or upside down and backwards and upside down. That's called prime, retrograde, inversion, and retrograde inversion. And so those are the 4 different ways of using that melodic sequence. And so composers would take that and maybe, extrapolate those tones across a wide spectrum and create a chord out of it. But it was all based upon that that series of intervals. And so that's kind of where modern music, particularly the earlier part of the 20th century into the mid 20th century, a lot of composers were playing with melodies using serialist techniques. So that's just a little bit of a discussion about melody. And I really, in order to really understand what I'm trying to say, I would encourage students to go back and study any of Bach's works, particularly some of his later works, like the Art of Fugue, like the Well-Tempered Clavier, and particularly what I mentioned before, the unaccompanied sonatas and partitas for violin, or the cello sonatas, is another great analysis and example of how to create melody in a way that is beyond what most people think of as melodies, leading to harmonic structure. But the main idea that I'm trying to leave with you today, in terms of understanding all of music theory, is to try to think in terms of linear flow, and to try to analyze music from contour, horizontal motion in contour, the way that a bird would be soaring through the sky, would be my best explanation of that.